Well, hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 288th New Social Environment. I am Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Jessica Morgan and Helen Lee. We're also thrilled to have the poet Andrea Brady here, who will read to close today's program. We start all of our events with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in Brooklyn, we are on the unceded land and waters of Lenape-Hoking, which still belongs to the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second acknowledgement is that Black Lives Matter. We recognize the legacy of settler colonialism as a part of the many contemporary expressions of white supremacy. We honor those that have lost their lives to this violence, and I encourage you all to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions as we all do our part in the learning and unlearning required to undo this legacy of injustice. Now to introduce today's esteemed guest and host, the Nathalie de Gunzburg director Jessica Morgan joined the Dia Art Foundation in October 2017. Prior to this, Morgan was the Daskalopoulos Curator, International Art at Tate Modern in London from 2010 to 2014, and was curator at Tate from 2002 to 2010. Morgan played a key role in the growth of Tate's collection, driving the development of the museum's holdings of mid-century and emerging art from North America, the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. Morgan was previously chief curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Boston, and a curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. Our host today, Helen Lee, has had many roles in the art world, including collector, academic, art advisor, art book editor, and auction house specialist. She has worked at Christie's, Harry N. Abrams Publishing, the Robert Miller Gallery, and for James Wolfenson, among others. Her passion for the arts derives from her belief that art and culture provide vital means of communication across cultural and political divides. Helen is an advisor to the Milken Institute for its art and culture programming, and she is also chairman of the American Foundation for the Courtauld Institute of Art, where she completed her postgraduate studies after earning a BA from Harvard. Helen is also a board member here at the Brooklyn Rail. So without further ado, Helen, I pass the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick, for those wonderful introductions. Jessica, how are you on this beautiful spring day?
I'm great, thank you, and thank you, Nick. Also, you meant all the complicated names that are attached to my name, which generally nobody can pronounce, and you did it perfectly. Bravo, and thank you to all the Brooklyn Rail team. You've been so incredible and professional in putting all this together, and especially thanks to you, Helen.
So I'm really excited to be here with you, Jessica. I'm a bit disappointed, though, that my ally and co-host Joachim is unable to join us, but hopefully he may be able to put some comments and his comments and ideas in the chat, as I hope everybody will join and put in some comments in the chat box. So 2 years in the making. Big congratulations on the successful reopening. I believe the official reopening date was April 16th. 2 years that included a pandemic and with it financial repercussions, but I'm really happy to say that at this point there's a lot of silver linings to this difficult time for our institutions, which have pivoted and reacted really successfully during this time. The global health crisis has shown how we are even more interconnected than ever before. And for instance, we are interconnected on online dialogues and platforms like this new social environment here at the Brooklyn Rail. And this has increased our dialogue. And as the public becomes more engaged, museums and institutions are thinking about ways to engage their communities and looking for ways to take the museum outside the walls and beyond the standard of blockbuster shows, and not only measuring the number of people coming into their institutions, their buildings. There seems to be a new metric around how institutions are relevant in the lives of people. Institutions have had to reflect on their missions and create and accelerate initiatives to make change. DIA's never fit into a traditional institutional mold, and instead it's been called the counter museum. So Jessica, with this to start with, do you think that's an appropriate label for DIA? How is it a counter museum? Or maybe we should even begin with, what do you think the role of the museum should be during this time?
Thanks, Helen. And yes, I concur with much of what you said. We actually, one of the things we struggle with fundamentally is the word museum. In fact, we don't use that as a term. I mean, we're a long title, this DIA Art Foundation, which of course leads to all kinds of confusion from a lot of people and lots of applications for funding, which we wish that we could support, but unfortunately, of course, we're in the same boat and researching and looking for funding ourselves. But I think, sort of going back to the origins of DIA, 1974, and when we were founded by our three founders, Heine Friedrich, who came from Germany, Philippa de Menil, who was the daughter of Dominique de Menil, who founded the Menil Museum, and Helen Fostick, who was also based in Houston and sort of part of the Menil workings at the sort of incipient museum that was being established there. Back to their sort of original vision for the institution was precisely that there wasn't a museum, that there was no sort of centralized location, there was not a singular point of view, but rather there was this dispersal and support for artists for individual projects, some of which, of course, we know and in our case still run and manage to this day, like the Lightning Field in New Mexico. Others like Chinati, Donald Judd's foundation in Texas, we no longer run, but which were part of this kind of origin point of really thinking about how essentially, DIA and the name itself, I think, is an important part of this. It's a Greek word meaning through or conduit, sort of how DIA could function as a support mechanism, as a sort of means of bringing into being these projects of individual artists. So that origin point, I guess, is something that we still look back to and try to refer to in everything that we do, although, of course, necessarily we have to recognize the fact that DIA has changed dramatically over the years, and we now, run and manage a site like DIA Beacon, which to all intents and purposes, most people would say is a museum. So hence the struggle that we have with our own internal terminology, with these sort of very different locations, some of which are still these very specific sites, artist envisioned sites dedicated to a singular artwork, and others which are, functioning in perhaps a more traditional way with multiple artists, albeit in sort of vastly expanded presentations in comparison to most institutions, and often on for much longer periods of time than most institutions would imagine, but yet still, perhaps performing a different type of function. So that doesn't answer your question at all.
No, it really does. It's a wonderful introduction to, we're going to touch on almost all the points, I feel like, that you've brought up. So just to begin, though, the idea that the three founders were very ambitious in their vision of what they wanted to establish, that they wanted to support new projects that were unmediated by overt limitations or that traditional museums and galleries might put on them. They championed under-recognized artists, or they tried or looked for under-recognized artists that didn't align itself so easily for one reason or another, perhaps because of needs of space or needs of support. So I think it's sort of an interesting way to think about institutions, that there's a need for institutions, not just for the more established or more traditional works of art, but that there's a place like DIA that is very important in the context of everything else that we have available to us. So we're here to really talk about how the initial thoughts of these founders are still there, but have developed. And I thought it would be really interesting to look at a picture of the original space, the space that you're in now, but how it looked before. So I think it says a lot. It's an industrial space that's been refurbished and originally housed marble works. Can you tell us about what we're looking at and how you came to find this location or establish this location as the current headquarters?
Sure. I mean, actually, funnily enough, this is the building that was most recently acquired by DIA. I mean, we have a long history on 22nd Street. You can see this nice signage at the top of the building there, 541 West 22nd Street. And for those of you on the call, and hello to everyone, because there's lots of friends here, and thank you for joining. For a lot of you, I know you're very familiar with the old DIA Chelsea building, which was on the other side of the street at 548 West 22nd Street, where since the late 1980s, DIA was programming almost as a Kunsthalle, actually, in those years. I mean, to give a little bit of historical context from that moment that I was describing a moment ago, this sort of origin moment with our three founders and these ambitious projects supporting artists with individual works, like the Lightning Field, for instance. The sort of next phase of DIA, which began under the directorship of Charlie Bright, was really this presence in Chelsea, where DIA acquired a really magnificent building at the end of our street here in the late 1980s, and from 1987 on was operating as a supporter of artists for commissioning projects, but a different generation. So the generation that perhaps we would identify with artists who were emerging in the 80s and 90s. A sort of next step in our history, of course, was the opening of Beacon, the loss of that building across the street. But what I think perhaps a lot of people weren't aware of, and I certainly wasn't aware of as a visitor to DIA during that time in the 90s and 2000s, was that actually DIA owned three other buildings, or in fact two, and then a third building on the other side of 22nd Street, one of which had been used for some programming. I mean, many people here again probably saw the Richard Serra Talk to Lipses originally shown in one of these buildings, and Bruce Naumann's Mapping the Studio. But in the other two buildings case, I think there was not an awareness that they belonged to DIA and they weren't used programmatically. So the building that we're looking at now was the one that was acquired sort of most recently, now about 10 years ago, and enabled us to connect these three buildings on the north side of 22nd Street. And this Marble Works factory, as you say, was a raw space. I mean, it actually doesn't look so completely different right now once you're inside of it. I can see the wall markings are still there if you visit now. But it was really the sort of catalyst that enabled us to think about how we could establish a footprint back in Chelsea as an active exhibition space again. There's a long story behind that of sort of multiple directors with multiple visions that ends with me, and sort of where we decided to move forward, which was uniting those three buildings in the space that we're using now, and as you mentioned, just opened a few weeks ago.
Nick, why don't we go back to the image of the DIA facade as it has now been refurbished and renewed? I think we have one or two images of that.
Oh.
Yes, there we go. So the Marble Works building is smack in the middle, and without going into too much detail, I think it's not as relevant because it's so beautiful to look at the finished product now, is that Jessica, when you came on, you sort of didn't think, you rethought the design and connected the two adjoining buildings to create what we see now, which is a very uniform look with the exposed brick work that connects the two buildings that were originally part of DIA with the Marble Works building that we just saw. Tell us about some of the things you had to consider when you were having to rejigger sort of previous plans for the way that the DIA had been thinking about renovating.
So when I started, Helen, there was still on the table a project to essentially build a new build on this site. And I don't know, intuitively, it didn't seem right to me. I mean, DIA's buildings have always been these repurposed industrial buildings, which, I think for very good reason, they have a kind of humility, I think, in regard to being spaces for showing art. There isn't the sense of an architect's authorship that sometimes we find clashes with artistic authorship, let's say. But more importantly, actually, initially, the most important thing was just to take a moment and think about what we really needed. And for me, as somebody who was coming back to New York, having not lived here for 12 years, having been back in London, which is where I'm from, to come back and understand exactly what was happening in terms of particularly contemporary commissioning work in New York City, and thinking about what it was that we would offer that would be relevant, frankly. Dia Beacon, when I joined, was and is, an extraordinary space with so much potential. And I think there was a lot of thinking, obviously, around what we were planning on doing there. And we basically experimented for a few years. We did a number of different projects with Rita McBride and Kishio Suga, Francois Morellet, and sort of felt out what we could potentially do in these spaces in their unrefurbished state. And I think, all felt very confident that they had great potential in terms of the space they were giving. And most importantly, heard from artists. I spent a lot of time with Zoe Leonard in particular, looking at these buildings and thinking about the spaces that we had, and heard kind of loud and clear from artists that these naturally lit, simple spaces were really, ideal. I think this picture actually perhaps shows more than anything what we decided not to do, which is build up, which you can see our neighbors perhaps didn't go in that direction, but there we go. But, I think one of the big questions was this amazing, I don't know if it's just a New York thing, but this incredible American concept of air rights, which was a new concept to me. The idea that you own the air above you. And of course, we made a decision that was definitely not what we wanted to do, precisely because we would lose the natural light, but also fundamentally lose the history of these industrial buildings in Chelsea. And it felt like we actually, if we just owned one of these buildings, it wouldn't have been quite such a substantial statement, but that there was something to be said about retaining this history as much as we could control that. And this was, this was something that we could do to kind of, prevent this kind of additional build in the buildings that we were so fortunate to own, which is, by the way, an incredible luxury to have in New York. I'll also mention here, just because it's in this image and a very important part of our presence on 22nd Street, the Joseph Beuys work, 7,000 Oaks, which spans from 10th to 11th Avenue along the street, is a lasting part of our presence on 22nd Street. And so, connecting with that and honoring that work as well was an important part of our staying there, because of course there had also been a lot of conversations about selling all three buildings and moving to a different part of New York.
I love how the current space reflects the organization's overall ethos, preserving what you have, that the modesty is intentional. I especially love the idea that you went to the artists to say, or the artists who have worked previously and traditionally with Dia, to ask them what type of spaces they preferred. And I think it really speaks to, when you see the works that are there at Dia, both the Lucy Ravens and at Dia Beacon, that you can almost sense that what the artist created what it looked like in the studio. It's not sort of a whitewash put on a pedestal, typical white gallery or museum setting. It feels more authentic and real in some ways. So I also think it's really interesting, Jessica, and maybe you can talk about some of the ideas behind this, whether they were intentional or not, that it is very street level. There isn't huge signage or a lot of stairs to climb when you go in. There aren't Greek pillars, for example, to just say, this is a statement about who we are and why we think you need to come. It's very understated. What are your sort of experiences or things like that?
I see that first image of the sort of unrefurbished spaces was showing a project we did with Isabel Lewis, which was a really fantastic durational project that Isabel conceived both for our Chelsea spaces and also in Deer Beacon, in the trails that are run by Scenic Hudson, so down by the waterfront by Beacon. And for us, it was really a sort of wonderful realization of how porous the potential was as well. And the openings that we did put into the building, and these new facades, those old facades, unfortunately, were quite literally falling away from the building. So we had to replace them, but we wanted to echo that ability to kind of open up to the street. So the bifold door that's in the old Marble Works factory allows us to kind of have that same type of relationship to the street. And the other thing that I think was very important for us being street level was being able to move our program, our talks and program space down to street level, which obviously right now we're not able to have a audience in there, but let's hope come even September, we might be able to start having in-person programming and having the capacity to relate to people who would be wandering off the street and coming in to hear a program, rather than having to go up to the 5th floor, which is where they were previously, was all part of this, not to mention the fact that we're free, all of our New York City sites are free, just the ability to kind of wander in. And, I think we're all looking forward to a time when the COVID restrictions that require us to sort of have a little bit more of a interaction in terms of taking information state officiated as people enter the building. But I think ideally, our hope for Dear Chelsea is also that it's a place where people can gather. It has it has plenty of space where people can just be. I mean, wonderful to see whatever the project is, but also hang out in the bookshop, hang out in the talk space, which is essentially an open space to people during the day, and have it be somewhere where you can gather.
So I was actually just going to mention the bookshops, but one of the first things you see when you walk in to sort of check in and do your COVID check is an amazing expanse of books that relate to your programming, but also the history of DIA and so much more. I can imagine spending many lovely afternoons just in the bookshop. So I think that's also a very interesting sort of difference with other, more traditional museum settings, that there's an educational aspect to it that's made really transparent and welcoming to the public, which sadly we don't have a picture of. But let's move on a bit, if we can, to some of the wonderful images we've gathered, because we've mentioned some of the land art sites that are in far-flung places that I, for one, haven't been to all of them. And it would be great just to talk about how they've been doing over these past, couple of years. And I don't know, I'm curious, for instance, how often do you visit them, Jessica? And we'll start with this one, the Earth Room.
So New York City, the Earth Room, the New York Earth Room and the Broken Kilometer, which are both in Soho, reopened in September. And in fact, we've sort of been eking out more and more days as we went along. The New York Earth Room is in a incredible co-op building. So there are also people living around this artwork that occupies the 2nd floor. So of course we were extremely sensitive as we were reopening about the comfort level of the people in the building, and only reopened when they were willing and able to accept people coming in, which they so graciously do through the lobby of that building. But all of you who are in New York or able to come and visit, I encourage you to go. Bill Dilworth, the incredible person who's worked for us now for more than 3 decades, is back behind the desk and welcoming people over the weekend hours. And the Broken Kilometer, which is just down the road on West Broadway, is similarly open from Wednesday to Sunday. And I think what's been interesting for us actually with those sites in the city is precisely seeing a more kind of New York-based audience come back again. Obviously, as all sites in New York are experiencing, the sort of tourist visitor has gone, and actually for the Earth Room especially, that was a huge number of the people who were visiting. So we did see a sort of massive drop-off in visitorship, but at the same time, just incredibly happy to be able to offer these spaces. And I think that like the land artworks that we can talk about in a moment, but they offer that long-term perspective, which is so quintessential to dear works. I mean, you visit, I always feel when you're standing in the Artforum, and I'm there often just hanging out with Bill and seeing who's coming by, but you always hear people reflecting on the fact that they've been coming over the years or haven't been perhaps for 20 years. And while the work is still the same, of course, you've changed and the environment has changed and the context has changed around it. And it has this extraordinary sort of both constancy and ability to completely change according to both our internal and external perspectives. So they're extraordinary works. And, I think I personally, find every time I revisit, there's something you notice or there's something that you bring to it, which is a kind of a new perspective, let's say.
I haven't been in a while, but I do remember seeing it for the first time. And it is just a remarkable experience to see all 250 cubic yards of dirt. You can sort of get a sense of it from this picture, but it's really nothing like actually seeing it in person. And I've always been really amazed that it's been there since it's one of the first projects, I think, that the founders envisioned and has been maintained since 1977.
That's true, Helen. I mean, this space actually, before Heiner established DIA as an institution, this was actually his gallery. So the work of De Maria was actually the last project of the gallery. So essentially, the decision was made to keep this work on view forever. So I don't know. Try and imagine something like that happening now. So,
I know, Jessica, the idea of trying to find funding for something like this, it really just goes to show DIA's commitment to the artist's vision to realize their dreams with little, thought of recouping on a commercial level. So it's just I think it's an interesting project just to see a little bit about what the mindset of the founders, the group that put this together, what they were thinking, and which still speaks to the projects that you're putting on now. I think we have the lightning fields next. Yeah.
Which is, Jessica, you were asking, so actually I was just on a call with some of the incredible people who work for us in visitor services, including Jess Zegelin, who's someone who's in charge of managing the bookings for the lightning field. Of course, we had to close last season. I mean, for people who are familiar, this is a work which is 1 mile by 1 kilometer, encompassing these individual lightning rods that you can see here in an extraordinary grid surrounded by a mountainscape in the fairly remote southwest of New Mexico. And to visit requires an overnight stay. So you are met by some of our team in Camado, one of the small towns nearby, and taken by our team out to a cabin, which is adjacent to this work and so to the side of the work. And you spend the night, you watch the sundown, you watch the sunrise, and then are picked up and taken off the next day, provided with a meal. But one of the very special characteristics of this actually is that if you're booking as an individual person or a couple, there are 3 bedrooms and they're booked independently. I mean, potentially you book the whole cabin, but normally you might go out and you would find yourself with 2, 3, 4 other people who were strangers. And so that kind of social experience was also very much part of visitors' experience of going to the lightning field, but necessarily was also one of the reasons why we had to close things down, not to mention the fact that we were deeply concerned about our team out there and the fact that there's very little in the way of medical services in the near vicinity, so we had to be extremely careful for them. But this weekend, the first visitor is returning. The beginning of May is the start of the season traditionally, and we've just had to come up with a new way to manage this, which is just individual pods of people, or in this case, there's just one person going, which I think is amazing. It's a very COVID lightning field visit. He'll be our first visitor this weekend. So it's definitely been a struggle to figure out how to reopen and make it publicly accessible again. I mean, it was already difficult because the demand was so much more than what we're able to do. The season is really from May 1st till the end of October, because it simply gets too cold and too harsh an environment after that. But we're gradually picking up speed again, and I hope we'll get back to normal ultimately. But one of the incredible privileges of this job is of course being out there and being able to visit, and also spending time with our team, who are extraordinary people. Robert Weathers, who is one of the people who actually built the lightning field, is one of the people who runs it. So his knowledge and history and experience and really geographical knowledge as well is just unsurpassed. But yes, it's one of those very singular experiences, which frankly is impossible to convey really, unless you've been. And it's different for everybody, of course, and it's dependent on the weather and the time of year and who you are as an individual and who you're with, and so many different factors beyond the physicality of the work and fundamentally the journey there, which I think is one of the things that you come back to with so many of the DEAR projects is what do you experience before you actually arrive there. And in this case, it's the most extraordinary journey through a landscape of natural features of, quite spectacular, but also to my mind, something quite unearthly. There's a huge sort of tar flow at one point. So it's, by the time you get there, you've already had this extraordinary experience. And I think, undoubtedly that was in the minds of the artists who were working at that time on these projects, was precisely to enable you to encounter this extraordinary landscape on the way.
I have to say, I'm completely jealous of the sole visitor who is the first to visit the lightning fields during this time. What a way to sort of break a pandemic isolation period. But 10 years to create, and it's a work like other DIA works that are intended to last forever. And I just feel like that concept is just, it was very, sort of mind-blowing then, but even more important now, more than ever, given the situation that we are with the financial restraints that we're all facing, all the institutions are facing. So just an amazing story still, just as relevant. Nick, what image do we have? I think we have Spiral Jetty to show as well as one. Oh, sorry. Of course, The Sun Tunnels by Nancy Holt. That's another great.
And
Utah.
Incredible work. I mean, this was a work that we acquired. I mean, if you can acquire land work, I sort of question whether that's really possible in some ways, but we see ourselves very much as the custodians of these works. But this was something that we did shortly after I arrived here. Nancy Holt had sadly passed away, but this work was something that she always hoped would come under DIA's sort of aegis at some point, and I was incredibly eager that we could do whatever we could, really mainly just to make sure that we were helping to maintain and conserve the work. There was a small amount of conservation, although actually remarkably little, given that these are concrete structures that have existed and that, again, a sort of very, very dramatically changing environment according to the weather during an average year. Extraordinary piece in this sort of flat basin landscape, again surrounded by mountainscape, but very, very far away. And these essentially sort of, they're like vast viewing devices. I mean, concrete tunnels with punctures in them that replicate different astrological configurations, but which are the concrete elements themselves are aligned with the summer and the winter solstice. It's really, I mean, it's again an incredible work that, rather like the lightning field, takes you through a extraordinary landscape before you arrive there, and then provides, in a very, I think it's very typical of Nancy Holt's work. It's perhaps more so than any other artist who was engaged with the land at that time. Nancy Holt was so thoughtful about geography. So the work is essentially allowing you to view the landscape around you, and it's prioritizing nature and geography. It's really about making you look. It's extraordinary work.
And then I think we have one more of the 11 land art sites.
Spiral Jetty, yes, yeah, which is sort of on the other side of the Salt Lake in Utah, and literally into the bed of the Salt Lake. This is new photography, actually, both sites that we were able to take a little over a year ago. And the jetty, again, I think rather like the lightning field, that these are also, they can be strangely, I think often you've seen so many images of these works that when you arrive there, they can be strangely underwhelming when you first arrive. And then it's the more time you spend that you sort of see it under different circumstances and from different physical relationships as well. When you first encounter the jetty, you're not in this spot here, you're sort of off to the left of this image as you drive around. But of course it looks quite small and you've been imagining this kind of enormous thing. But then as you get down to the Salt Lake bed, there's both the now, of course, the water with the drought that has been a sort of almost constant problem in Utah now for many years. But the water, there's sort of water around the piece, but it's certainly not submerged in the way that it was for so many years. But it's also not sort of lapping water around the piece either. But the ground that is left because of the salt content is the most peculiar kind of lunar landscape, salt encrusted landscape. And one can, move through and around the piece, which gives you a completely different perspective on the work. But, perhaps more than any, it's the piece that really is, so much about submerging you in this, very alien looking environment, looking out at this pinkish water of the Salt Lake. Again, all I can say is it's one of the great privileges of the job here, to be able to visit and repeat visit, because every occasion it is such a completely different experience. The weather conditions, the people that you're with, the way in which you approach the piece, whatever happened that day, it's an extraordinary, an extraordinary experience. And we have seen, I think I was mentioning this to you before, Helen, whereas of course we had to close the lightning field. In fact, with sun tunnels and Spiral Jetty, we saw this incredible uptick in visitorship during the shutdowns. I think so many people were, perhaps finally able to make that trip, particularly locally. These are very beloved works in Utah. The jetty is actually the national artwork of Utah. And I think many people were able to visit and did visit because we saw this incredible increase in visitorship.
I think it's also interesting, you mentioned how it looks different because of the time of year, or just that time passes and one might have a different impression of it. But it also speaks, I think, to ecological and geographical climate change issues, conservation, in a very sort of subtle way, just to see the changes that these works envision. And I just was trying to prop up my computer, and it's just such a important work that so many different, it's just something that is always in people's mind. And I think partly it's because you wonder, how was it made? Who made it? And is it sort of an alien creation from, some mysterious force? They both fit into the landscape and seem extremely idiosyncratically important in a way that want you to question and think and consider where it is and what it is. Shall we move on to the current show at the DIA, which is by Lucy Ravens, an American artist who is from Idaho, if memory serves. Is that right? Oh no, sorry, I'm missing a whole section about Jessica. We really want to know about your previous life as a curator. And we have a couple of images of some of your shows at Tate Modern, which I thought was an interesting contrast to the current space that you have. I think we have an image of a show you did at the Turbine Hall. can you tell us a little bit about this and how it was to install and what it was about?
Sure, yes. I mean, so for 12 years before I came to DIA, I worked at Tate Modern, which was an incredible experience. Tate Modern had just opened and was kind of inventing itself in some ways. I think it still is actually in a really great way. Certainly when I started, I was focused mainly on very contemporary exhibitions, a show called Commonwealth and another one called Time Zones, and they were sort of group exhibitions looking at sort of, I suppose, different explorations of contemporary practice at that time. But I was also able to work on a number of the Turbine Hall projects, including this project with Dominique Gonzalez Forster, which I was thinking about. That's why I sort of shared this image, because Dominique's work has often had a very strong kind of narrative component, and this work, TH 2058, was a sort of dystopian vision for London in 2058. A sort of unnamed catastrophe had happened, probably climate related. There was a kind of misty rainfall as you entered, and things had started to grow to outlandish proportions, including artworks. So the Louise Bourgeois that you see here, and the Calder, and there's various other works down there in Oldenburg, and in sort of Dominique's, narrative had been brought inside of the museum to protect them from this kind of whatever it was in the atmosphere that was causing this kind of distortion. So these were fabricated, I mean, with permission of the estates of these artists, but fabricated by an incredible prop shop actually, who made these are kind of gigantic versions of these already gigantic artworks, of course. And the beds, which were kind of spaces of refuge, really, for the citizens of London. And an incredible film, which is at the back, I don't know if you can make it out on the LED screen there, from which Dominique sort of spliced together references from a multitude of films that were both sort of reflecting on the kind of history of dystopian thinking and science fiction in particular, but also referencing some of the previous installations in the Turbine Hall and the history of that space, which itself, particularly at that beginning point, was such an important sort of event, let's say, in London. I mean, that these projects in the Turbine Hall at the beginning were kind of at a truly wonderful popular level of sort of bringing in audiences across the country who were sort of drawn not by, I mean, nobody knew who Oliver Eliasson was, or certainly not, Dominique Gonzalez Forster, but they were brought in by the sun or the giant spider, or and it was, for me, working in the Turbine Hall and what that space offered was always an incredible experience, precisely because of this very, very kind of palpable public relationship to the work. And we're seeing it here at a quiet time, but people would hang out on the beds, they were covered in books, and it was they're always very much about creating a social space.
So Jessica, even then, you said this was about 12 years ago. You were already thinking about outsized works of art and big industrial spaces. I see the skylight, the natural light that's come in, and also community engagement, which I think is such a big, important issue that we are working towards now.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, having grown up in London with, freely accessible art institutions, there were spaces where I certainly spent most of my teenage years with my friends, not necessarily looking at art, but definitely hanging out in the cafe and smoking cigarettes. But they were spaces where we were welcome, or at least certainly we weren't kicked out. We could sit in the cafe for an entire afternoon, and we were allowed to peacefully gossip or whatever we were up to. So the Turbine Hall really functions that way for young people, which I just find, just endlessly inspiring, actually.
Again, an industrial space that was repurposed and was quite surprising. There's still a hum, I think, when you walk in there, at least that's my impression of it. But so Jessica, my question to you, looking at this and picturing what it must have been like to describe this show, what are the differences, do you think, from being a curator and now being a director for you? I mean, did you have to go to Nicholas Sirota and explain what you wanted to do with the turbine hall, or how did that work?
Good question. There was a lot of politics and lobbying, I'd say, and it depended on, I mean, then when I was there, the director of Tate Modern was Vicente Todoli, who is a really wonderful person to work with, I have to say, always just so engaged and would want to meet with the artists we were working with, who was really, you know, very much involved in every aspect of the sort of culture of the institution. But yes, definitely, it was a lot of, you know, there were multiple curators, actually not as many as you might imagine, but we were definitely all sort of working together to think about the program. I think, you know, when the biggest, there are so many differences, and I think, you know, obviously DIA is a very specific institution as well, so it's impossible to compare to Tate, and the you know, Tate is a national institution with a you know, deep commitment to, in the case of Tate Modern, you know, representing a very broad international perspective. But you know, I think maybe one way to answer it is, I think for a lot of curators, that move to becoming a director is something that perhaps is not of interest for very good reason, because it will prevent you, frankly, from curating. But in my case, I think it particularly became interesting, perhaps from the perspective of being able to make internal decisions in an institution myself, and being able to do things differently to how I perceive them being done. And I think, you know, there comes a point where perhaps that frustration leads you to want to be somewhere where you can perhaps have a go at doing things a little bit differently. And that was appealing to me at a certain point, although, like I say, I think it's definitely not, and it shouldn't be for every curator, because the work, you know, I often look back up the things that I did at Tate, and I deeply miss a lot of the work that I was able to do there, and the connections that I was able to have with artists over long periods of time, which is very different now, certainly. I mean, it's not that I don't have deep relationships with the artists, but you're not in that journey together producing a work, which is always, you know, incredibly exciting. And one, you know, I think fundamentally what I've always enjoyed about my work, and which I, you know, again, recognize to be such a great privilege, is that you're constantly learning. You know, I'm constantly in the position of being ignorant about so many things, and that, you know, your work is to learn from the people that you're working with, from the artists that you're working with, from the people who are engaged with the institution, from your visitors, of course, from the entire team. And it's just a different process of learning in a director role. You're learning about different things, but it's equally fascinating.
So Jessica, I think we're going to have to do a part 2, because we've got to move on, and we've already taken up so much time, and we haven't even gotten to the show that's up right now. This is a great, I think, one of, if you don't mind me saying, a wonderful show that you, The World Goes Pop at the Tate, which is a global show bringing together artists from all interesting parts of the world that would not necessarily get the same sort of exposure as you've given them in this particular case. And I think that's it. So we can move on. Sorry, Jessica, we have to move on to what is up right now, which is this wonderful, do you call it one commission or two? Because I thought of it as two disparate works, but maybe you're thinking of it as one commission because they're up at the same time, and you've worked with Lucy Ravens for years in conversation to develop these particular exhibits?
Definitely two works, or actually even three, because in fact the light works that are in the first gallery are two pieces brought together. And I should say that, you know, it's all credit to the curatorial team here, Kelly Kipland and Alexis Larry, especially, who worked with Lucy over many years. And as you mentioned, I mean, initially we had invited Lucy to work on one of the series of what we call talks, although they're often not talks, called Artists on Artists, where we invite an artist to kind of reflect on the work of an artist who has a kind of longer engagement with DIA. which Lucy accepted and in fact made a film rather than giving a talk, and worked with D'Anthony Parks, who's the incredible musician who she worked with for this film Ready Mix that you see the still of here as well. And that was already, I think, almost 4 years ago actually that Lucy did this, and it was from that conversation that developed around that time, and clearly her sort of very sort of expansive thinking about our history, but also some of the artists, and in particular a relationship to the American West. She is from Arizona, as you mentioned, and I think had thought with certainly the eyes of somebody in the 21st century about what it means to work in the American landscape at this point. And through this kind of conversation out of that initial film grew the idea of having her take on the spaces here as we were working on the renovation. And the film that you see here, Ready Mix, was a work that was many years in production. She filmed in Idaho at a concrete plant. And in the adjacent space are two light works that are part of a series called Casters that she's been making for some years now, that are also choreographed over a period of time.
Nick, maybe we can show very, very short clips of both with the sound down. I love, I read a quote in one of the articles, one of the reviews of these works, that Alexis Lowry, the curator, told Lucy Ravens to go big or go home. And I thought that was just such a encouraging, supportive, and also a big boost to any artist, that there's scale, time, space to realize your works.
Yes, and I think when we were thinking about what would the program be for Chelsea going forward, I mean, one of the things that is very important to us is feeling that we're making a difference in some way. Lucy's work is very difficult to make, if impossible indeed, without resources. She doesn't have a gallery. She teaches, and that's how she supports herself, but there isn't the budget to make a film like this. And so our input was, of course, helping her make this work, and of course I think a conversation as well with the team here about the sort of thinking through the installation part of it, because it's on this extraordinary kind of CinemaScope screen in the space, which has sort of become, I don't know, our fetish object at DIA now. And really occupies the space in this extraordinary way. I mean, she was very interested in the history of drive-in movies and the kind of publicness, I suppose, of that communal space. But it does occupy the space in the most extraordinary way. Yes, and these are the Casters light works that kind of track the work. I mean, she's spoken about them as connected to her interest in cinema, and perhaps the sort of early cinema without image, expanded cinema, sort of Moholy-Nagy's experiments with projected light, but sort of thinking about the history also of this technology, the Creed lights, both its military history and its cinema history. You can see the kind of crosshairs which occasionally do cross each other in these two lights. But also have, here you have this kind of almost lunar kind of atmosphere as they cross the ceiling of the space, but a kind of constant dance, which I think I mentioned is sort of a 2.5 hour choreography in the space. And
it's being played continuously on a continuous loop, I think.
Exactly, yes, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that it was really interesting for me to just watch people react to the works. And then there's just sort of both, as you say, the crosshairs of being reminded of like searchlights of sort of a prison where you might have an escaped convict and the searchlights are sort of looking around. But at the same time, it was also a little bit like a promoting a Hollywood premiere, especially when people walked in the center so that they could have the spotlights on them. For whatever reason, I thought that was sort of an interesting way to react, the two different sort of ways to sort of imagine or react to this work. And I see now you are counting both sets of caster lights as two different works, even though they interact and cross over.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had so 2-year-old in there the other day who was sort of trying to gather up the light on the floor, which was beautiful to see.
That's so interesting to see how different people react. No, there's an uneasy relationship, I think, to wanting to be visible or wanting to be part of it, but being also afraid at the same time of being like having the spotlight on one at the same time, or at least that was my personal experience of it. But just beautiful. And again, the space looks both humble and subtle, but at the same time just perfect for these works of art. You couldn't imagine I think I read that people or artists were saying that natural light was why fight it or put lipstick on a pig when there was just such a beautiful sense of light in the space anyway. And I can't imagine having a more beautiful setting for this type of light installation than what you've presented to us. I think we just have about 5 or 10 minutes left, Jessica, sadly. I'm very sad about this. And we have some images of Dia Beacon, because I think for a long time, we associated Dia Beacon as Dia, not just in the past 2 years of renovation, but I think since the mid or late 90s, when Michael Govan was director and decided that there wasn't enough space and brought it to its current to Beacon, where how many hundreds of square feet do you have on view?
An extraordinary 300,000. Yes, yeah, and Beacon opened in 2003, but it did coincide with the closing of the space on 22nd Street that I was talking about before. So I think in many people's minds, I mean, including my own, I have to say there was a sort of lack of clarity about what was going on, and had, was this now Beacon in yes, Phyllis, Dorothea Rockburn's room, in upstate by the Hudson. I think, when I started, again, I think there was also, to my mind, just this extraordinary potential for Beacon. I'd spent a lot of my work at Tate actually had gravitated towards the collection over the years that I've been there, and come to really think deeply about how significant collections are and what they do and what they can do, precisely because of their permanence, and who you're giving resources to through acquisition, and obviously space to through display. So one of the most exciting things that it seemed to me was precisely the potential of this space, and the fact that it was treated with great sort of reverence by artists, and that being part of that collection was something that was important to people, and that we had this incredible potential to open up who we were showing there, because it was in fact a pretty limited picture of the time, because our collection by and large does focus on this period of time where artists were emerging in the 60s and 70s. So here you see this installation by Dorothea Rockburn, who has a number of galleries on view at Dia Beacon right now, and who we worked with very closely to remake these installations that she had made in the late 60s and early 1970s that were ephemeral. And frankly, I just knew from the cover of Artforum or odd pictures that I'd seen over the years, but had never been able to experience personally. So one of the things that I think has been also very important to us is sort of bringing to light again these works that weren't necessarily available to people because they had simply not been reinstalled, and bringing them into this, if not permanence, at least semi-permanence. I mean, Dorothea's work will have been up for 5 years in a year or so. So that sort of sense in which you can have this repeat visit, and that an artist who perhaps should have been part of the kind of history of this period can now become more familiar to our audiences, but also perhaps to those who are looking at this period.
More visible for a longer period of time, for a period, and encouraging consideration and study. So it's not just a passing moment, that you have shows that I think are no less than 9 months, or more like a year, if not many years, like this.
That's true. One. Yes, Chelsea is sort of, well, for us, a very short period of time, which is, but we'll have one project a year, and that's like that's the shortest time frame that we work with. But in Beacon, we tend to work over a much longer period of time. And we've had immense change there, bringing in Anne Truitt, Mary Corse, Sam Gilliam, Charles Gaines. Thank you is incredible work of Sam's, who I was just speaking to yesterday, and talking again about just how important this work has been at DEAR. And I think that's also part of it, is thinking about works that really open kind of doors for us in DEAR Beacon in terms of people's understanding of materiality, process, the thinking, the sort of politics behind the work. And Sam's piece, this kind of radical rethinking of painting, is just a kind of so expansive in what it offers, in relation to the other works that you're seeing in the space as well, which is part of this. You see this beautiful metallic paint here, which of course, as the light changes in the space, kind of moves in the work itself. So each one of these editions, I think, has offered us kind of a new way of thinking about, okay, what could the next step be? Where else can we go? So where else can we explore? We're working on a big installation with Joan Jonas that will open in the fall, and Sengen Nagudi is actually up in DEAR Beacon today, thinking through a whole series of rooms. So there's just so much potential in Beacon, which just makes it, for me, I've never worked with a space like that before. I mean, it's just it's really an incredible opportunity to kind of create almost these sort of exhibitions within a larger environment. It's not it's a very expansive experience that you're able to offer an artist.
I think I have a bunch of interesting numbers, but I just wanted to bring out one, that the number of women artists, I think when you started, was only 6, Louise Bourgeois being one of them, although this is not part of the collection. It's part of the Easton Foundation, which is her estate. But I think there are now 23 of the 57 artists who are women. Is that right?
Sounds about right, Helen. Yeah, I mean,
anyway, there's Mary Corse, you mentioned, Ronnie Horn, Joan Jonas, Dorothea Rockburn, Anne Truitt, of course. Just wonderful women artists, and Lucy Raven, who's being given this opportunity to show their works in this space. And I have to say, the Louise Bourgeois and the Lucy Raven pieces, they are just as strong and demonstrative of their artistic practice as any of the other works that we all love and have come to recognize as DEAR works. I just love this image. I happen to have taken it myself because it just, I think, shows the vibe of the Nabisco box factory that has been repurposed, not just in the sort of people who are just sort of hanging out on the brick wall, leaning on the brick wall. I mean, where do you get a chance to hang out on a wall in a museum? But in the way that the works are displayed. I know that it's a considered installation, but you can walk around them. They feel very intimate. And you really feel like you're getting to know them in a way that's different from just seeing things in a glass box or case or on a pedestal. And it's something I really enjoyed. And do we have a few more images before? Oh, the Encore installation. Just such a beautiful room to enjoy. This is exactly what I think Encore's works mean to me, in that the works that he made every day, they're not assuming or more significant than the next, just the way they're hung low, one after another. This is his smallest format that he uses. It was just such a wonderful experience. And of course you have the Clara story, the lights from above illuminating the works. But I think we need to move on now to Nick, what else? Liu Fan. Jessica, do you want to talk about your time at the Gwangju Biennale and this work?
Sure, yes, yeah. And I'll just say, working with Mr. Lee it's also wonderful working with artists who are coming into these spaces, because in the case of Mr. Lee and so many other artists we've worked with, they've already visited so many times and they've actually thought about exactly what they want to do. So in his case, he knew exactly the spaces at DEAR Beacon that he was interested in, And then we were working together on identifying these very early works, but that's very special. You know, it's a little bit like the Turbine Hall, perhaps, where I think quite often artists have thought, you know, if I had a chance to do that, this is what I would do. But Dia, I think, has often inspired that in artists as well, to think about which space would they love to be in. But yes, just before while I was still at Tate and before I arrived at Dia, I worked on the Gunzburg Biennale, which was just an incredible opportunity. So back to this, you know, I guess emphasis on learning, because it afforded me the chance to spend extended periods of time in Korea, especially, and work with so many incredible artists there. I mean, the art scene in Korea is just phenomenal. There are generations of extraordinary artists, and that was a really incredible experience for which I remain extremely grateful. And Gwangju itself has an incredible history. Of course, there's a biennale that's based on a town that was the site of the uprising in 1980, and the terrible massacre that took place before the emergence of democracy in South Korea. But that history, the context, the people who work there, and especially the artists that I was able to work with in Korea, was just a very important experience for me. I have to say, I'd never been interested in working on a biennale before, but when they approached me about that, it just seemed, you know, it was a place that I had always wanted to spend more time in, and yes, it was a great thing to do with an incredible team. So and it perhaps also set me up a little bit for moving into this director role, because essentially you have to build a team and build a kind of envision a temporary institution in a way.
Yeah, that's a very good point about the intensity of working on a biennale and the large scale installations that you sometimes need to put together, and how to work with artists to complete projects. And speaking of big projects, there's the Carl Craig. That's also, I'm sorry, this is a beautiful room, but we don't have time to talk about the Richter, sorry. The Carl Craig room, thank you, Nick, for the video, but we're looking at a still here of the installation shot, which I don't feel like really does justice to what the work is about. Jessica, can you help us understand it better?
Sure, yes, I mean, Carl, and I should say this is true for so many of our projects. I mean, Lucy, over 4-year conversation with Carl, it was actually, I think I remember going to meet him with Kelly Kivlin, one of our curators. I think it was a few months into working here, because we were talking a lot. I mean, Kelly has an amazing performance background, and we've been talking about our history with sound at Dia, Lamont Young's Dream House in particular, which was the first project that we realized here in Chelsea, but also Max Neuhaus and the many different commissions that we'd had over the years, and wanting to think about how would we extend that history with industrial sound, with drone sound, like how would we bring that into the present day? And we're both thinking about the incredible history in Detroit, and Carl Craig was immediately somebody that we thought of who would be, you know, such a sort of fascinating person to engage around this history and see if he would be interested, which he immediately was. But we literally spent, 5 years working with him, bringing him to the different spaces, spending a huge amount of time in the lower level at Dia Beacon, listening to the reverb, having Carl obviously think about the relationship to the many spaces he's worked in Detroit, that hence why he was so drawn to these spaces, because there's such a strong similarity between the industrial spaces of Detroit and this level, this Dia Beacon itself. And he just has made the most extraordinary installation, which I think continues to amaze all of us. I mean, it's a sound and light installation, which it's kind of narrative in a sense. I mean, it's a loop of a little over half an hour that is called Party After Party, that takes you through a kind of almost euphoric dance, evocative, just sort of really, extraordinary kind of uplifting mode into his experience of what it is to be a musician, DJ after events like this, where he has tinnitus, terrible, sound reverbs in his head, you know, that for hours and hours and hours afterwards, if not actually ongoing issues with tinnitus. So this kind of dystopia that follows the utopia of the party. And with this kind of changing light environment about it. But he, you know, it's a complicated space. It's filled with columns, as you can see. It's concrete with all kinds of sound issues. But Carl managed to produce this incredible environment, which of course we had a concert with Carl on March 6th, and you know, later that week had to close down Dia Beacon, like everybody had to close down every space across New York State. So we had, you know, less than 1 week with this installation, but then we're able to open in the summer. And it's been, you know, it's just been an incredible space to be in, of course, in the absence of clubs, in the absence of collective music spaces. This enormous space with this incredible sound environment.
I think we have a little a sample of that, but I just want to note, it looks like a perfectly sunny day outside, but this is sort of the atmosphere. And I think I saw somebody in the chat box mention that it felt like a bit like a club or a nightclub. I mean, that's the title, Party After Party. And I think it's just sort of a really evocative work that's perfectly fitting. As you say, we're all, you know, wanting a bit of a party atmosphere. And I think this works well and is probably very popular with the audience at Beacon. So Nick, are we gonna show some of it? Jessica, that this time has gone by so quickly. I feel like we could have gone on for at least a couple more hours. I cannot believe that we are needing to end this talk now. We could have spent an hour on each one of the land art sites and Lucy Raven's show that's up now for so much longer. But thank you so much for your generosity, for sharing just your journey to get to this very successful and celebratory moment. I
Thank
think
you for even asking, Helen. I'm like honored that people are interested.
No, seriously, I think there are measures about this time, this difficult time about museums, whether you've lost staff or the financial state, or whether you're able to put on exhibitions, and you've sort of hit every single mark. You opened, you've got the exhibitions up that you were planning to put up, and it's just marvelous, and it speaks volumes about the clear vision that you have for Dia. So congratulations, and thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you. Well, that's having an incredible team. It's not me, I have to say. You know, it's like an amazing group of people I work with, and they have, yeah, it's been a year of incredible work together, but I give all credit to them.
Well, I meant a collective congratulations to all of you and all the Dia supporters out there, who I know there are many as part of this Zoom as well. It's a marvelous place, free admission to the 5 sites in New York, and Dia Beacon is open with Carl Craig, as well as all the other works that we know and love there. And Nick, are we ready for questions? I've seen some good ones come through the chat box.
We are. Well, I want to thank you, of course, Jessica and Helen, and to Joachim in spirit. There's a lot of love for Dia in the virtual room. I want to start actually by reading a comment that was shared by our dear Rail comrade, Lynn Crawford, who says, "I'm a founding member of the Museum of Contemporary Art, Detroit. We opened in 2006, but spent years before conceptualizing it. Dia was always and continues to be one of our major influences." So Dia continues to just inspire and make everyone fall in love. So we have plenty of questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can with the time we have. First, I'm going to pass the mic over to Susan Landgraf. Susan, you should be able to turn on your mic.
I want to thank both Helen and Jessica and the Rail for this wonderful conversation and a lot of visual stimulation as well. I made several. I mean, there was a lot that came up during this. I think the first place, I have two places I want to go. One is when we were in the land art area, and you were talking about community work and the actions. And so what I'm wondering is about what actions DIA is taking at all its locations to bring in audiences that do not usually encounter art spaces and work, and bringing in diverse groups beyond youth groups. I really would like, during this time where we are up for the possibilities of enormous change, if DIA could sort of lead the way, as it has in so many ways, as far as contemporary art, and how, since your leadership, it has also finally put all those dusty men from the 60s and 50s in their place and brought in women, because last time I was there was probably about 2 years ago, and I came away very angry. And even though we saw pictures of Louise Bourgeois in that space, my remembrance of seeing her work at DIA back then was that she had been put as the mad woman in the attic. And I would like, I don't know, I mean, now that I hear Joan Jonas is going there, I'm going to have to return to see that show. And I would hope that Louise Bourgeois has left the attic. So could you talk a little bit about how you can imagine expanding community work? Like when I saw the work of, I can't remember the name now, the artist that was on the CinemaScope screen, Lucy Raven, right? That screen, and that's right here in Chelsea, right? I mean, what the potential for engaging young people in that space was just thrilling to me. So what do you have to say about that? Because I can talk.
Thank you, and I think that you pointing at exactly the right question, because I think if anything, you know, when we reopened last summer, much as I was happy to see some of the artworks, what I was mainly happy to see were people in our spaces. And I think, you know, the big shift that has happened and you know is really in the forefront of all of our minds is the spotlights on the people who are coming. It's not so much on the art, you know, and who are the people and how are we reaching out, as you say. And it's a lot to answer in a short period of time. I mean, I think I would certainly say we've got a long way to go for a start. Being free is just the first step, because that doesn't in any way deal with the, and despite the lack of steps and dark columns and all the rest of it, art spaces are intimidating places to go. They are, I think, especially in, I have to say, perhaps in this country, that they're particularly intimidating places to go. And we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we're bringing people in, not just reducing the barriers by being free. And there are many ways in which we think about that. And we have an extraordinary learning and engagement team who do incredible work, particularly in the Hudson Valley, I have to say, in bringing incredible communities into our spaces. And similarly in Chelsea, particularly once we're more able to do this, we're slightly hampered by the COVID situation right now. I mean, we're working with the groups that we've always worked with in our community here, but obviously we would like to be reaching out more, and will be once we can particularly have more in-person interaction, which I think we're hoping from the summer on, things will begin to ease up more and more. And in Utah, for instance, I mean, a lot of our work there has been collaborative. So we work very closely with the Great Salt Lake Institute, which is an incredible science-based institute run by two extraordinary women. Their team, their students, their young people, also the UMFA, which is a fantastic museum on the campus of Utah University, who work with us to think about who we're bringing out to these sites and how can we make them more accessible, more more approachable, let's say, as well. So it's teamwork, you know. I mean, we do what we can, but we also work with other people who are, you know, in line with us and thinking about each of our sites. Bridgehampton, we have a space in Bridgehampton where, again, you know, it's working with the kind of collective community there to think about how are we bringing people into this space that can often be missed in your kind of journeys in that area. So it's sort of different strategies for different spaces, but this is, as I said, I think you're putting your finger on the most important point, which is who's coming and what are we doing to make sure that they feel welcome and that they're aware of the fact that this is a space that is for them, you know?
Well, thank you so much, Susan, and thank for your question, and Jessica for your answer. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to David Ross. David, you should be able to turn your mic on now. Just a moment.
All right. Hi, Jessica. It's great to hear you go through all this and to see the Chelsea space, which I haven't been able to get down to see yet. So that I'm dying to see the Lucy Raven piece. I think you deserve enormous credit for having brought so many changes to the Dia collection and to the idea of the Dia collection. There are extraordinary works by women who are of the same generation as the men who dominated the Dia collection for so long, as well as new ideas like Lucy Raven. But I wonder how Dia is handling this entire decolonizing moment and how Dia is looking at the sources of its wealth and the wealth of its primary patrons. You know, it's as problematic, if not more, than many other institutions because it's a small, tight group of people. And I know that you've been very thoughtful about these things. I'm wondering how the institution is approaching this.
Thanks, David. And you know, I'd add to that too. I mean, when you talk about decolonization, and I think Susan, your point touches on this as well. You know, we have land artworks that are sited on lands that obviously were indigenous lands that we have not addressed, the artist did not address, and it's very much a focus of our discussions internally about how we move forward in relation to not only recognizing that, but thinking through the complexities of what it is for the future of our ownership of these sites. So this is very much, I would say, at the center of a lot of our conversations at Dia right now. You know, coming from Europe, the funding structure here in the US is inherently problematic. And I guess I was actually just talking about this with one of my colleagues this morning. You know, much as I think the necessary finger pointing is happening at individuals on boards, I would love to see alongside that a groundswell of demand for public funding of institutions. You know, many of us have experienced, you know, life-saving support this year from the government, life-saving support through PPP, through tax efforts. And, you know, I say to my board constantly, you know, this is what we should be receiving every year. This would, you know, make such a huge difference to our perspective for our, you know, future envisioning of fundraising and all the problematics that you're pointing to, David, within that. We are, you know, we're a public institution. We're free across almost all of our sites. We provide a huge educational opportunity for thousands of people every year, in-depth experiences for young people, you know, and that's just us. Of course, there are countless institutions across the US providing, you know, a public program which should be publicly supported. So I would love to see, you know, an activist call for public funding of the arts, and with that, of course, an assessment of all of the problematic tax issues in this country as well. But I'm European, or at least I was until the UK made the, well, actually I still am, thanks to my Irish mother. But you know, I think it's a structural problem, and you know better than I do, David, having, you know, done an incredible job of running, you know, the Whitney and SF MoMA, how complicated this is, and how little, you know, that generally our public funding is frankly a big fat zero, you know. So this year for me was really a point of like, well, why is this an exception? Why does it just have to be this year? Surely, you know, this is something, if we truly believe in this, why wouldn't this happen every year? Because that takes a level of pressure off us that is just, you know, huge. It's hard to describe, really. That's my feeling.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you, Jessica, for that really thoughtful answer. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to Rail's own Phyllis Hookman. Phyllis, you should be able to turn your mic on now.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Hi, this was great. Now I can't wait to come downtown now that I finally have done my rail duties the other day. So I'm looking forward. Jessica, this is kind of bringing you back to the Tate. I'm wondering, which works of art do you most miss seeing?
Good question. And actually, this is, I mean, there's probably many, Phyllis, of course, like everywhere, but in fact, I was just, again, in this a recent conversation, I was reminded of, you know, I guess I was precisely talking about what it is to bring works into a collection and how important and for me, yeah, powerful it was to be able to be part of that change in an institution. And at DIA, I worked, at Tate, I worked quite considerably on the collection of work that we brought to Tate from the Middle East and North Africa and also South Asia. And there was one acquisition in particular of the Iraqi artist Dia Al-Azawi, who I think probably a lot of you hopefully saw his work at PS1 and a recent exhibition, and his incredible collection actually that was at PS1 as well. But there was a work of Dia's that we acquired at Tate. Gosh, I can't remember when I approached Dia about it first, but I feel like it was probably confusing. He's called Dia. I work at Dia, but Dia Al-Azawi, not Dia. But it was probably a good 12 years ago now or something. And it's a massive, extraordinary painting called The Massacre at Chevron and Shatila, which was the terrible massacre that took place in the 1970s. And it's a huge, incredible artwork that he made over a period of time, actually while he was living in London, because he lived in London for many decades. And we acquired it and we were able to put it on view quite soon afterwards. And I've never forgotten, I mean, for me, this was really, you know, why collecting work can be so important, was it went on view in one of the display galleries at Tate Modern. And I remember going up to the gallery the day it was on view, and there was a huge group of school children sitting on the floor drawing this work, you know? And it's just, you know, it still gives me goosebumps to think about it, because, you know, these kids were going to go home and they were going to talk about Dia Al-Azawi, not about, I don't know, Georges Braque or whatever it might be. I mean, this was the work that they chose to sit in front of and draw. And so, you know, these changes that you make are real, you know, and that they are so important, and they're so important for changing the stories and changing the understanding of what our histories are, you know. So I'll say Dia Al-Azawi's Massacre, Chevron and Shatila.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Phyllis and Jessica. I think we have time just maybe for 2 more questions quickly. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to Rail Events Assistant Malva Kajali.
Hi, Jessica. I wanted to thank you for this amazing presentation today. I really liked what you said about being sort of a counter museum, and I'm wondering, sort of to extend that question, about what you see as kind of counter ways of being within the space of a museum or the space of like an arts institution. A little context, I feel like in the past year, we've sort of been experiencing a kind of push for a radical shift, like a recalibration of the space of the museum and how we can disrupt the relationships that an art museum can have with its community, that an institution can have with like broader oppressive structures. And I see all of these pushes, whether it's like colonization, whether it's, you know, labor practices, as sort of perhaps forcing us to think differently about the museum and ways of being within the museum. And I'm wondering, I know you spoke to this a little bit with David, but I'm wondering, you know, where you locate yourself within these dialogues in the art world, how you kind of make sense of it, and how you anticipate, or, you know, perhaps are already seeing the art world recalibrating and transforming in perhaps the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. It's a great question, Malvika, and again, lots of different ways to think about that. But I do think you have to think about it inside out. And I think so many people have made, have made this point very forcefully. I mean, if you're not practicing your ethical standards internally, then it doesn't matter what you do externally, because the contradiction is so so complex, which, as I've mentioned with funding, I have not solved that one. That's one that we will all have to continue working on. But I think one of the attractions, I suppose, of being director was precisely trying to not replicate some of the structures and systems that I felt that I worked in that were problematic and perhaps very painful for a lot of people, I think, over the years that I've witnessed in different institutions. And it's not pointing fingers at any particular people, but I think it certainly has taught me a lot about what not to do, perhaps. And I think, one of the things that has been very important here at DEAR is also thinking about the way our teams work together, the degree of communication and transparency across departments. We've seen sort of really extraordinary and I think seismic shifts between our learning engagement, curatorial and publications teams. These are all teams that are producing the content at DEAR, and seeing them as equally significant voices in the institution is something that I certainly really prioritize, and I think is really for me the future of institutions. What is curating these days? I have big questions about that, and who has the skill set to really think about what that means into the future. I think many of us in institutions recognize deeply that our learning and engagement teams have those skills, and the rest of us often don't. So that this is, I think, a huge area of growth for all of us, and I'm happy to say it's something that we've been talking about and thinking about for some time here and enacting. I think, as I would say, I sort of take that from that point to how you engage with your publics, with your communities. And in our case, it is complicated because I often sit in sort of museum meetings where people are talking about their community, and I think, oh my gosh, which one? It's like, is it Chelsea? Is it Beacon? Is it, they're all very different, and our physical presence in these different spaces is very different. In New York City, I think of our peers and our close relationships are with the kitchen, like whose space actually used to be ours, or I have huge admiration in Doris Sally at the Queen's Museum, or sort of smaller to mid-size institutions are the places that we kind of relate to here. But I also recognize that in Beacon, in the Hudson Valley, we're a big monster, and we're a huge employer, and our footprint is both physically but also conceptually very different. So it's a very different, it feels very different. The approach is very different according to the place that we're in, as it should be, sensitivities around that, and what we can offer and what we can do is very different according to the spaces that we're in as well. What are the the public spaces? What are the offerings? What are the what is our capacity, I suppose, within those sites? But we think about it a lot. I think, as I would always say, we've got a long way to go everywhere, but really trying to understand what exactly our potential is for our publics in each of these places is something that we think deeply about, and I do think we're getting better at, but there's a lot more to do.
Thank you for that beautiful answer.
Yes, thank you, Jessica, for unpacking some of these questions that were so big, so thoughtfully and concisely. I want to thank everyone so much for joining, but also for participating in the chat and for asking questions. Apologies to those we could not get to. But for our final question of the day, I will pass the mic over to the Rails publisher and artistic director, Phong Bui.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you, Jessica, and for a wonderful conversation. I just realized when I first came to New York, I read a long piece on New York Times Sunday magazine by Grace Glow. You probably remember it too, David. But I think it was called something like the Menil family as a Medici of modern art. And it was a very long piece, and it's nice to be reminded that the continuity built from the very beginning, from the history, in that Mrs. de Menil, Christophe, had that strong relationship with Father Marie-Alain Courtier, who was so important to the kind of aura, distinct presence. One can even say spirituality, because I think it seemed to me that where even her daughter Adelaide ended up marrying to Edmund Carpenter, and then there's Clark Levi Strauss, my friend, Francesco Polizzi was a student. So there's a continuity, history building that too, which doesn't quite surprise us how it relate and committed to earth art, the so-called anti-establishment. So I see that it's very beautiful, that continuity, but to maintain that relationship with, or given that kind of relationship and complete freedom to the artist's autonomy, not to say that people like Michael Heiser is easy to deal with, but nevertheless, I'm asking, how do you maintain that, knowing that Shinadi, through Don Judge, had now operating within the family and their own organization, and how would that be the same with Michael Heiser in his city in Nevada?
Which we don't have any formal ties with Heiser City anymore either. I just want to clarify, are you asking sort of how those types of relationships are now in existence with our present relationships with artists? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is something we think about so much. Obviously we don't have the resources that were, coming from the Menil family at that time. So we're working with a different budget, but I think we also try to focus the work that we do so that we can give what we can to the artists that we work with. And a big part of that is also time. I don't think we've ever entered into a project with an artist where there's a sense of, okay, this is the slot that you have and have it done by then. And, the kind of more routine museum work, which certainly I was used to in every institution, which is, in September we open a show, in January we open a show, etc. We just don't function like that. I mean, the work is ready when the work is ready, and we support the artist for the length of time that it takes to get to that point. And I think that is certainly that was a huge difference for me coming here and realizing that was something that you could offer an artist, was this liberation from those strictures. With that, is there a publication? Is it a record? We're making a vinyl record with Carl, and actually we might well be doing that with Lucy as well. It's like, what all these, the sort of other parts of it are very much up to the artist and what feels right for that particular project. There's no formula, there's no time formula, there's no work formula. I always think, one of the most exciting projects that we also did while I was here was working with Jennifer Laura and Guillermo Calzadilla on this project in Puerto Rico, which I hope one day we'll be able to put up again, which was again a land art journey in this extraordinary landscape in the southwest of Puerto Rico. But, we would certainly never think of saying to an artist no. If Lucy had wanted to do this in Idaho, we would have said, great, let's do it in Idaho, and we'll figure it out. So I think that the kind of lack of the sort of, the typical kind of strictures that come with exhibition making it remains very liberating and I think deeply important to what we do,
Yeah.
And not falling back into those modes, which, can be terribly, because they're so present, just reminding oneself and pulling back from that and is incredibly important. Yeah.
Well, which what make Dia so unique, as its own aura and contribution, very distinct. So thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure. And lovely to see so many people I know. So thank you all.
That was awesome. Back to you, Nikki.
Thank you, Fong, and thank you again, Jessica and Helen, for today's talk. Here at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with poetry reading. I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Andrea Brady, to the stage. Andrea Brady is an American poet living in London, whose books include The Strong Room from Crater 2016, Domptus from Book Thug 2014, Cut from the Rushes, Reality Street 2013, among many others. She is the professor of poetry at Queen Mary University of London, where she founded the Center for Poetry and the Archive of the Now. Her upcoming books include Poetry and Bondage, A History of and Theory of Lyric Constraint from Cambridge University Press, and The Blue Split Compartments, which is coming from Wesleyan later this year, I believe in August. Without further ado, Andrea, the mic and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for inviting me and for just a terrific, really riveting conversation and so many artworks that I want to see when that's possible. So I'm going to read from The Blue Split Compartments. Frozen. I think they should live our experience. The tarmac inequality, mile after boring mile. The same white strip, the same cat's eyes. The persona fades like early sleep and the hard world goes on hiatus. It's an eclipse in thought, a parenthesis, a subject dropped through a hatch. And still the hurtling machine, the glass shelter, the poisonous fire, darts around obstacles, each a little cabin of self-preservation, only millimeters from catching death. You go on like this on autopilot for months, simultaneously totally present, and a grating mass of absence, but able to do that job, which is not to die. And then that stupid moment when you catch yourself doing it. Had I been asleep for hours, my daughter floating in my palm? I was so engaged in the number plates and the colors, I forgot to recognize myself as a soldier. Hardly breathing, I crossed 2 lanes, put on the hazards. Snapping back exceeded the heart's strength to tolerate electrochemicals. My head swam with the bright proximity of violence. Some part of me must have wanted to. Saying some part locates that part as an alien object tapped into my viscera that can't really be found. I sip water, take a cleansing breath, ease off the pressure. Celebratory gold ribbons of rain cut the midsummer sun and anoint us, but they are wrong to do so. The mountains grilling like the roots of a tooth. Frozen. My nerves were bad. The trees gathered the wind in their branches gently, holding it for us as noise alone, but not for long. Frozen. We shut our eyes, hide under our scarves, put our hands over our ears. Even when you don't see them, you can hear them. You know they're there. They're all over my brain. I can't sleep. There's nothing anyone can give us that makes it better. I just turn on the light and sit there looking at the light. 24 hours a person is in stress and there's pain in his head. If you bang a door, they'll scream and drop. It weakened my brain. My mind was so badly affected. If I'm walking in the market, if I'm shopping, if I'm standing on the road, we can't drive cars. We run out of our houses. Of all the progress and advances in the modern world, only these reached us. Closed. What do you see? I see a man dressed in a drab flowing robe with a white cap on his head, casting a long shadow in the dirt. Where is he? He is in remote tribal regions. What is he doing? He is hiding in caves and walled compounds. He is training in empty deserts and rugged mountains. He is taking refuge. How did he get there? Red 1998 Suzuki Vitara, Hyundai Santa Fe, Toyota pickup, double cab Hilux. Where is he going? From Wadi Sur Highway to his home in Had Ali Shak village in Wadi Sur. Who is he with? 5 men in a grove of date palms. What kind of men are they? Ragtag militants, rabbits in a dry hole. What are they doing? Not gathering for a bake sale. What do you hear? Makar, cat fart. What will you say? EKIAs killed while meeting their fellows. What is red? The only thing hot enough around here to be a body. Activated. So this is a durational work which explores notions of temporality and visuality under late capitalism. It takes place in a specially constructed box, a performative space that mimics the state of exception by inducing an extreme situational awareness within which seldom do we see the actual bodies. The box obliges viewers to engage in synoptic viewing, using techniques drawn from sports broadcasting to reveal our acquiescence to persistent and totalizing surveillance. The artist who has presented this work at South by Southwest is associated with the new aesthetic, which is known for constructing politically inflected representations through algorithmically driven imaging and devices, borrowing both from modernist machine art and the experiments of the conceptualists. She calls this work the Gorgon stare. Warning, flash photography and strobe lighting are in use, potentially inducing tactical blindness. Activated. 4 grinning trumpets stand before a portrait of the Visionary by Ralph Wolfe Cohen. It's Papalotl with her flint-edged wigs, Galitne, the Reaper, Io, the Whirlwind, Miru, on the tip of her tongue. Frozen. Oh, little cuck, oh, snowflake, look at these snakes and propellers, how they mitigate your horror by hardening targets. Let them replace your penis, the absence of which is that feeling's cause. She wears it on her dress, the wings of the vulva from which the devil fled, not a fleshy body, but a digital statistical trace. Intolerable soft men. Put him in bed with the captain's daughter. Then the king returns, a necessary stingless instrument. You have a blessed day, blinking your large eyes, fertilizing the queen whose ring you twisted when you suddenly went invisible. You remember that story. The vain chief and his trophy wife, the stupid heiress, eating a steak well done with ketchup and Riyadh, swatting his tiny hand like a fly. And what happened then? She was pissed. Dressed for the job she wanted. That was the joke. A widow? She up and armed her invisible visitor. It's not a moral opportunity. He got the throne and her prosthetic jawbone, but she, these expensive, these is red bottoms, these is bloody shoes. She got the money and the blood of the man who pimped her to that common invisible dolt. Closed. The chair bone's connected to the sky bone's connected to the nothing bone's connected to the nothing bone, gonna walk around. Opened. The blood is ready, and when it is ready, it falls. Seeing the large clumps drop into the water, I feel something akin to pride. It billows out in clouds, like any mammal slipping its life out into the ocean. And when I'm standing, the ache in my cunt and my hamstrings makes me think of O, and I'm frightened of the animals sniffing around as I wait for the lead weight and the collar. Water makes this blood abundant, though the mood is foul, the smell is foamy. The child has disappeared, I wrote on the window. Someone I didn't know answered. That was a dog. Activated. Go ahead and throw down your sparkle. Thank you.
Snaps and claps. Thank you so much, Andrea, for that amazing reading, for closing out not just today, but this whole week of NSEs. I want to thank you, Jessica and Helen, once more for joining today and for this wonderful conversation. Very quickly, I'd like to add, the Rail is celebrating its 20th anniversary as a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free and accessible criticism and community events to everyone. If you enjoyed today's event, please consider making a donation to keeping the Rail and our special projects free, relevant, and independent. I'm going to post a couple of links in the chat for that. And if you're available, join us Monday at 1 p.m. for a conversation between artist Josiah Michelini and Rail editor-at-large Charlotte Kent. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from Eileen Tabios. You can now all activate your microphones to say hello or goodbye, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Helen. Thank you, Andrea.
Andrea.
Thank you very much. Such a
Reading.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Alan, always great to meet
Thank you.
Jessica, glad to get to know you.
Jessica.
Thank you, Andrea.
Andrea.
You're fabulous.
Everyone. Hi,
Have
Phyllis.
a good weekend.
Yes, have a great weekend.
Great weekend.
Absolutely.
Beautiful afternoon.
Bye-bye. Have a great weekend.
Support the rail, support Dia.
Support the rail.
Yes, hi, Phyllis. Thank you for the reading, Andrea. Also,
Beautiful reading, wonderful talk, Helen. And
bye, Jessica. We'll see the show soon. Bye, Helen. We'll talk soon. Bye.